Hello. Why are MGTOWs politically incorrect? Well, a little bit of history before I get into that. Well, what can I say? It's all about the story, the narrative. That is why a black conservative can be openly attacked and berated with racist rants with impunity. This is a problem. These are men who have come to their own conclusions and are being attacked for thinking for themselves. But I digress. That's a whole nother video. Alright, this is how it's kind of come about. Prior to the First World War, Karl Marx predicted that the mob, being the public, would unite by class consciousness to abolish national identities and bring about the utopia of global communism. The followers of Karl Marx didn't consider this theory. They considered this to be a scientific fact, and that conflict, war, violence would trigger the Great Communist Awakening. This did not happen, and well, after World War I, it didn't happen. Well, it did. It came about in Russia, which at the time was an agrarian society with little better than a feudal system as their basic political system. Anyone that has unfortunately seen the first 10 minutes of the movie Anastasia will have seen this uprising. This did not happen in the Western nations were capitalists and industrialized. As communist science ensured that it would. So a group of followers of Karl Marx had decided to try and figure out why communism did not take hold in the West. Originally it was to be called the Institute for Marxism, but they decided that a name like that would be a bit too honest. So they named it the Institute for Social Research. Social justice, anyone? Later it became known as the Frankfurt School. And after the rise of Nazism, since most members were Jewish Marxists, they left Europe and came to the US. And set up shop at Columbia University in New York. While they were stationed in Germany at Frankfurt University, the Frankfurt School, they made the argument that the people were too blinded, yes, blinded, by the success of capitalism and the wealth that it generated. They were too blinded by these trappings of capitalism to realize their class consciousness and bring about the communist revolution. While at Columbia, they were also basically right next door to the Columbia School of Journalism, which awards the Pulitzer Prize for excellence in journalism. This is important. Well, they were set up. They had a shop set up at Columbia until 1951, when they decided to go back to Europe. But while they were here in America, they were still known as the Frankfurt School. While the Frankfurt School was here in the U.S., they made a breakthrough. They figured out the need to separate Marxism from economics and began to marry it and combine it to the culture. The result of this change in thinking and implementation would become known as critical theory. Critical theory is just as it sounds. It means to criticize, something we have all had to experience. First, the genius of critical theory is that it can appear to be as a result from society as a whole, and it can attack Western society from all sides simultaneously. But they must keep in mind that only the sins of Western culture are to be criticized. For example, feminism. Feminists could attack Western culture for its oppression against women. However, it must seem the oppression is unique to Western culture. No mention of as to how women were treated in Muslim countries, China, across Africa, or the cultures in South America is to be allowed. Any mention of the treatment of women in these societies would run counter to the narrative and must be suppressed. Any mention of these facts would be deemed politically incorrect. At the same time, African American studies were to only focus on American slavery, and that any mention of the fact that only 5% of all African slaves that came to the shores, or actually, only about 5% of all Africans taken from Africa as slaves came to the shores of the United States. That's not the way they make it sound in the news, all those wonderful journalists. That's not the way they make it appear. They make it appear as though it was only the soon-to-be United States that was the primary culprit. Anyways, they were to focus on the brutality of the American slave owner and his treatment of his black slaves. They stressed that, while at the same time ignoring the facts that it was Africans hunting other Africans. And much of this is a result of the spread of Islam across the continent. The Muslims there are still kidnapping people and selling them into slavery. Boko Haram, anybody? It was a source of wealth for many tribes at the time. Facts like this make slavery more about economics and less about racism. These facts run contrary to the narrative and are therefore politically incorrect. So now, both gender studies and African American studies can both attack Western culture using critical theory. We are seeing the same thing today with homosexuals. Gender studies, feminism studies, African American studies, Native American studies. They all use critical theory to break down classical literature to show oppression in all forms are the result of Western culture. That is part one. Part two is the real spark of inspiration. This is something, once again, we have all experienced. Criticism never requires or needs an alternative. These people, they offer no solution, no alternative, and they can criticize with impunity. There is no logic, no history, or fact-based foundation from which they base these arguments. But why should facts trump ideology? Why should facts get in the way of a good story? These are all things we have heard. These are all things we have seen. One of the cornerstones of progressive and socialist ideology is that, and I quote, "Logic is not independent of content." What? Are you kidding me? Yes, it is! The narrative set upon us by a socialist construct of academics, and anything that goes against the narrative is politically incorrect. This is why MGTOWs are politically incorrect. We are politically incorrect because the narrative is that we are violent misogynists. The narrative is that we hate all women, while ignoring the fact that we are just choosing to opt out. We are, in a sense, going GALT. By going MGTOW, we are no longer feeding the system of oppression with its boot on our neck. If I may borrow a comment from Barack Obama, the whole boot on the neck thing. We run counter to the narrative, which makes MGTOW a threat. And the more visible we are in our rebellion against this system, against these social constructs, the more visible we are in not being anything close to what they try to make us appear to be, makes us that much more politically incorrect.